World of Warfare presents Bombing Christmas. The final 3 months of 1944 brought a steady cloud cover over much of Europe, obliging the 15th Air Force to rely on Pathfinder radar bombing on nearly 70% of its fourth quarter missions. This raised an increasing moral specter over the direction of the air war, since the inaccuracies of radar bombing ensured that bombs were now falling on heavily populated residential areas as much as 2 miles from their intended target. The problem was further heightened by Curtis LeMay's policy of bombing on leader, resulting in an even wider footprint of erroneous destruction and loss of life. As one pilot commented, the planes at the head of the formation wasted the marshalling yards, but the rest of us wasted the town. With the Luftwaffe all but absent from the skies over Europe, 15th Fighters increased the number of strafing raids on Axis transportation and targets of opportunity. In general, Mustangs were assigned to escort the Big Friends on bombing missions, while P-38s focused on dive bombing missions, primarily because of their capacity to deliver bomb loads up to 2,000 pounds. P-38 pilot Gail Mortensen of the 14th Fighter Group recalled, "You wanted to start high enough to look around, but you couldn't get too steep because the P-38 accelerated pretty fast." Unlike the Navy's dive bombers, such as the Grumman F-6F Hellcat and the Voight F-4U Corsair, early P-38s were not equipped with speed brakes, which placed heavy G-force loads on P-38 pilots as they pulled out from dives. Lockheed finally added dive recovery flaps to their P-38L model, which left pilots flying earlier model Lightnings with no alternative but to tax their bodies and their machines with incredible amounts of physical stress. Meanwhile, 15th Heavy Bombers continued to pound Axis cities and infrastructure into a new Stone Age. Flying his first mission with the 376 Bomb Group, Navigator Hal Heist experienced a near-death moment when a pilot in his formation suffered a disastrous case of vertigo. The number 2 plane had a wing stall and went right down in front of us, right down through us, he recalled. And our pilot dumped the plane and put our B-24 into the tightest spiral. They said you couldn't get a B-24 into a spin, but that was about as near a spin as was possible. I was immediately slammed to the floor of the office in the nose of the plane. The centrifugal force held me there. I couldn't move. I was frozen to the floor, and all I could do was look up at the gauges and watch the altimeter spin, the airspeed indicator going way up past redline, 300 and some miles per hour. And I said, well, this is it. And somehow or another, our crazy pilot, Ed Hawali, pulled the airplane out. That evening, Heist went into Lecce, Italy, to blow off a little steam, and he ran into Lieutenant Beck, the bombardier on the plane that had miraculously recovered from a wing stall. "We're looking things over, and a little adventurous stuff," Heist recalled. "Beck and I did some things, We had a couple of drinks together, and he was showing me that he was an old veteran. He only had a couple missions to go. So we get back to the squadron area, and lo and behold, we're both on the next day's mission. He was in the number 2 plane, and I was in the number 3 plane. That was the end of him. The number 2 plane went down. I don't know to this day how many of them got out, if any of them got out." On a December 9th mission to Regensburg, the Red Tails of the 332nd Fighter Group met up with Germany's newest weapon, the Me-262 fighter jet. Approaching their target, Alvin Temple spotted an Me-262 flying in front of the bomber stream. When the jet changed course to challenge his presence, Temple dropped his wing tanks and attempted to turn inside the jet. However, the faster plane stayed out of Temple's range, instead bouncing a Lightning from the 1st Fighter Group. The Lightning pilot took evasive action, which gave Temple another shot at the jet. "I attempted to turn inside in an effort to close the distance between my aircraft and that of the enemy aircraft," Temple recalled. The jet made a 180-degree turn on the bomber stream, leaving the red-tailed pilots behind in a moment of stunned disbelief. "It was clear to all of us then," said Temple. "The Germans now possessed a plane that could outperform the Allies' #1 fighter plane." As the bomber stream approached their Berlin targets, two Me-262s bounced red-tail pilots Robert Williams and Samuel Watts as their Mustangs flew one above the other. Williams rolled over in an intentional stall, allowing him to line up a deflection shot as one of the jets went into a shallow turn. "I picked up a 2.5 radii lead on the jet and fired a long burst," Williams recalled. "I fired another burst and held it for about 2 seconds. I noticed hits on the aircraft and saw him fall out of formation, and I believe he went down." Moments later, Joseph Chineworth dropped his wing tanks and latched onto an Me-262 that was making an attack pass on the bomber stream. "I made a 90-degree left turn and was on the tail of the jet about 1,500 feet away," he remembered. "I fired 3 long bursts and then my gun stopped. I saw hits and pieces flew off his plane. Black smoke came from the enemy aircraft as he started into what appeared to be an uncontrolled dive." Charles Brantley and his wingman were momentarily stunned when 2 Me-262s passed by them like they were standing still. "I dropped my nose, being well within range," Brantley recalled, "and made several bursts on the ship that was in front of me from dead astern. My flight leader fired on the other. The jets broke in a slow turn in opposite directions, pulling us apart. I followed my target in a dive for a short while, observing hits on the fuselage. I then broke off to join my flight leader. As I broke away, the Me-262 steepened its rate of turn and dive. It was seen by my flight leader and other pilots to go down in flames." Reed Thompson witnessed 3 Me-262s making repeated strafing runs on the bomber stream of B-17 flying fortresses. "After he dropped his wing tanks, I saw an Me-262 in a turn to the left at 2 o'clock, he recalled. "I tightened my turn and fired 2 bursts, but I was out of range about 4,000 feet. The jet went into a dive and I dove behind him, still out of range and looking for him to pull up and allow me a shot at him. We began to dive from 26,000 feet on the way down. He did 3 barrel rolls and I rolled with him. I pulled out of the dive at 10,000 feet and leveled off. When I last saw him, he was still going down. I circled the area where I last saw him and located a puff of smoke and wreckage where I judged him to have gone in." The Germans' new weapon was fast, the Red Tails had learned, but far from invincible. Between mid-October and year's end, the 15th attacked 2 synthetic oil refineries at Blechhammer no less than 10 times, dropping 7,000 tons of ordnance on German oil. It also marked a milestone of improved range, which allowed the 15th to strike targets well beyond the Mediterranean theater of operations. The 15th's December 13th mission to Blechhammer extracted 13 losses, making for the largest one-day loss the 15th experienced on raids over Blechhammer. On the mission that day, David R. Epley's Liberator walked into a direct hit of flak, which killed 1 gunner and wounded 2 others. While Epley and co-pilot Noel A. Wood landed their crippled Lib back at their Pantanella Air Base, their ball turret gunner was lost to a case of premature bailout. After the ship received a direct hit through the left side, recalled radio operator Darwin Carlson, I started to open the escape hatch near the tail turret. Ball turret gunner Robert R. Davis was to my right while I was trying to open the latch, and then suddenly I saw that Davis was missing. It was my belief that Davis, thinking the ship was on its way down, did bail out through the hole blown on the left side of the ship. Sergeant Robert R. Davis later died of his wounds. By mid-December, the Luftwaffe appeared all but absent over 15 targets of interest. But on the December 17th missions to Odertal and Blechhammer, the 49th Bomb Wing encountered a resurgence in German fighter activity that took most 15th intelligence officers by surprise. Badly scattered by weather approaching the target at Odertal, the 461st 26 bombers reached the target in staggered waves. where they were jumped by a mixed force of 50 Me-109s and FW-190s. To make matters worse, because of the great distance flown to the target, the meager bomber stream each had their ball turrets retracted in an effort to reduce drag and fuel consumption, depriving the formation of 1/5 of its defensive protection. During the 15-minute assault, the formation was subjected to 20mm cannon fire, plus rockets fired from outside the bomber's 50 caliber return fire range. The Germans attacked from the rear, flying 2 by 2 before dropping beneath the undefended bellies of the ragged formation, downing 9 heavies and forcing a 10th to ditch in the Aegean Sea. 115th Airmen were killed or missing by the close of the raid. As the depleted formation pulled off the target, Marion C. Mixon put out a radio report for survivors, prompting one German pilot to cut in on the channel using Mixon's call sign. "Where is the rest of your formation?" the German taunted. After 20 heavies had been shot down, fighters from the 31st and 52nd Fighter Groups closed in to disband the Sturmflieger Squadron, claiming 28 kills at a cost of 2 Mustangs. Losses during the Odertal-Blechhammer mission represented the highest number of casualties to fighter pilots in the post-Ploesti stage of the war, contributing greater than half of the 15th's losses to fighters during the last 4 months of 1944. On December 20th, future U.S. presidential candidate George McGovern flew his Liberator Dakota Queen to the Skoda Armament Works at Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. Still an hour out from his target, his number 2 engine went silent, forcing him to feather the prop. "Anytime you lost an engine up there," co-pilot Ralph Bill Rounds recalled, "there was no trouble back at base if you dropped out and returned. A lot of guys did it." Instead, McGovern opted to limp onward to the target, where shortly before bombs away, Dakota Queen was rocked by flak. Soon their number 3 engine began throwing oil and smoking badly, and when the pilots were unable to feather the prop, their number 3 engine created an immense drag on the airplane, reducing the plane's effective power to about 1.5 engines. 1 minute later, Rounds later recalled in his diary, "She began vibrating fiercely. We tried to feather it again, but it wouldn't and just kept windmilling. We lost altitude rapidly, and number 3 burst into flames." McGovern had read in the pilot's manual for the B-24 that he had less than 5 minutes before the runaway flames would eat through the firewall and explode the gas tanks. Thinking fast, he dropped the nose of the bomber, diving down in an attempt to extinguish the fire. After 2 failed attempts, McGovern issued the bailout order. During the crew's stateside training period, McGovern remembered asking one of his instructors, "Colonel, we're about through with our training, and none of us have had a parachute jump. Shouldn't we be trained in that?" "Son," the colonel replied, "when you get into combat, you don't need any training on how to get out of that plane. You'll find a hole that a cat couldn't jump through if you have to get out of that plane." Back on the flight deck, McGovern tried one last time to feather the prop, and when his Hail Mary worked, he rescinded the bailout order and called his crew back to their stations. McGovern wanted to shoot for home, but he soon realized they would never make it that far in the Lib's current condition. The gas supply was low and the fuel was leaking, he recalled. McGovern asked his navigator Sam Adams for an airstrip between their current position and their Cerignola Air Base, and the best Adams could come up with was a fighter strip on the island of Vis. The only problem, Adams explained, was the strip had a 2,200-foot runway when a heavy bomber needed 5,000 feet to land. McGovern thought about crash landing in the Adriatic once they were close to Vis, but he also had heard about the 25% survivability statistic regarding B-24s ditching in water. On top of those lousy odds was the fact that they'd be ditching into winter water, which gave them precious little rescue time before hypothermia kicked in and took all of them to an early grave. When the island and runway came into view, McGovern saw that he would have to drop the bomber steeply over a mountain at the start of the runway, while the relics of a dozen crashed bombers littered the airfield on the other end. "When you hear those wheels touch that runway," he recalled telling Rounds, "get on those brakes just as hard as you can, and I'll do the same." They were on the brakes all the way down the strip, waist gunner William Tex Ashlock recalled. "We just kind of wheeled off at the other end of the runway, going pretty fast. We bogged down in the wet clay and stopped." From his vantage point in the cockpit, McGovern stared at the imposing mountain in front of him, then glanced at a foam truck that was hosing down his smoldering engines. After McGovern and Rounds hugged each other, they exited the bomber with the rest of the crew. Many dropped to their knees and kissed the ground. While a truck picked them up for a quick ride to headquarters, another crippled B-24 attempted the same short runway drop-in. McGovern and his crew watched in horror as the plane slammed into the mountain, killing all aboard. A month later, after his return to Cerignola, McGovern was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. On Christmas, a day of peace on earth and goodwill to men, a force of 250 bombers raided the synthetic oil refinery at Brooks, Czechoslovakia, as well as the marshalling yards at Weiss, Austria. Another 145 bombers headed out to transportation targets across Austria and Germany, including the filmmaker's father, Technical Sergeant Calvin A. Page of the 98th Bomb Group, whose mission on Christmas was to bomb targets of opportunity near Schwaz, Austria. Unwilling to take the lives of fellow Christians on Christmas Day, en route to the IP or initial point of their bomb run, the entire crew conspired to drop their payload on a deserted hillside before filing a falsified mission report upon their return to their Lecce, Italy airbase. 3 months later, on the last day of the air war in Europe, all 10 crew members would survive their second shootdown, this time crash landing in Pécs, Hungary. Before the Christmas bombing missions were over, the second bomb group clocked up its 100th heavy bomber loss, while an additional 5 Liberators were dropped from the skies over Innsbruck, including one from the 376th Bomb Group. When Bill Barton parachuted safely to the snowy ground, an elderly man and 2 children approached the flyer to offer aid. The threesome ushered Barton into a nearby farmhouse, offering him a chair and a shot of schnapps, while an elderly woman offered him Christmas cookies, followed by soup and meat. The flyer tried to communicate by using an English-German dictionary, but soon the police arrived to take him prisoner. As the police let him out, the woman asked, "You Catholic?" When Barton said he was, the woman said, "Dominus vobiscum," or "The Lord be with you."